CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode of our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Moyo. I'm excited to have this conversation here in Mombasa at the sidelines of our conversations on the contributions of the non-profit sector towards dignified and fulfilling jobs. I'm joined this evening by Walter Kasemba, who is with the organization Youth Unite Zambia. Walter, welcome.
Thank you so much, Prof, for inviting me to this platform. I'm really excited for the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I know that it's been a long day. Long day in the sense that we are here in Mombasa, like I said, to discuss with different stakeholders,
right?
You know, from government, from international organizations,
right,
from the non-profit sector, the private sector, etc. Just looking at, you know, the plight of young people, but also how young people end up recruited, employed, obviously by the private sector, by government. But one of the contributors to youth employment is the non-profit sector, which is your non-governmental organizations and their various expressions. But the question being, you know, are the kind of jobs that they get from this sector dignified and fulfilling? And like we heard in the morning, there's the definition of dignified jobs from the ILO perspective around decent jobs, but also you know, other institutions like the Mastercard Foundation and others have actually went on to look at, you know, other elements to dignified jobs, to talking about steady income, you know, issues of respect, issues of purpose, etc., etc.
Right.
I just want to get your sense from you as somebody who is young, but also running this organization that is about Youth Unite Zambia. What's your experience of young people at this current moment in terms of, you know, the jobs that they've got? Are these jobs, you know, decent enough to meet young people's expectations, but also change their lives and livelihoods?
Okay, thank you so much. I think you've asked a really important question, to be honest, and this is actually not a topic that is just being discussed within the civil society space in Zambia, but just with general young people in our country, and perhaps even in the continent, right? And I look at it from a twofold perspective in regards to what young people want in relation to, you know, job opportunities. Firstly, it comes down to livelihood and sustenance, right? And when you look at most countries, we've got what we call the food basket. If our young people are able to meet the basic standard of living, right, which is usually measured by a metric, to say, for example, if we're here in Mombasa and say the standard of living for a household of five is, let's say, maybe $100 a month or $200 a month, right? So I think policy-wise, from government setting, I think that is the standard that wants to be reached. At least a household should be able to be sustained in that regard. But even more than that is looking at what are the aspirations of young people. These aspirations are fundamentally stemmed from their ambitions and how they want to contribute to the growth and development of our country, which is where we usually find the problem, because there are quite a number of variables. Being part of founding an organization, Youth Unite Zambia, which deals with raising a generation of young people for the socio-economic and political transformation of our country, we have seen that many of the needs of the young people are not met because they're usually tackled from a singular perspective. So you find that, let's say, if young people want to be employed into formal employment with maybe government institutions, being in the civil service or perhaps maybe even in the private sector, a lot of young people have various challenges and hurdles that can stifle that.
Yeah.
There are skills challenges where the skills mismatch. There are political challenges where you need to know someone within the system. There are, you know, environmental challenges as well, in terms of access to those particular places that have got, you know, those opportunities. So I think all in all, young people really do face a major challenge, and being a non-profit, Youth Unite Zambia, we try and see how we can build capacity in young people so that they are able to not only be employable, but then learn how to harness opportunities that would be able to fit their employment need, both from their aspirations point of view and also just trying to get a basic income point of view.
Yeah, so it's I mean, you've already started talking about where I wanted to go, which is that what drove you to setting you know, this organization,
right? But
secondly, what are the gaps that you wanted to close, and in that regard, what are the various activities of Youth Unite Zambia?
Okay, thank you. So it's a funny story, right? This was not planned at all. So when I was doing my Bachelor of Arts in university, in my third year of study, I decided to venture into student politics. Right. And because of that, I said, you know what, I'm going to be the president of the University of Zambia. And I did my politics, and I lost that election. Interestingly, I lost that election. But then I had sort of an epiphany and motivation to drive my influence for young people beyond the University of Zambia. So 2 weeks after losing that election, on my, you know, campus bed, I decided that I was going to start an organization. It's going to be called Youth Unite Zambia, and we're going to drive that agenda. Of course, there are various challenges in the beginning because it just started as an idea, and I hadn't really been fully vested into how the systems of nonprofit works. But that was the genesis, the desire to serve my fellow youth demographic. Fast forward years later, we have grown as an organization that has at least significant influence within the civil society space in Zambia, as well as also building strategic relationships with multilateral institutions like the United Nations, UN Migration to be specific, and also the African Union Economic, Social and Cultural Council, that is the AU organ that deals with non-profits and civil society organizations. We have found quite a number of gaps as an organization in terms of our functioning. Primarily, it stemmed from finding proper resources for us to execute what we need to execute. As you would know, it's not just an organization that is youth-centric. It is youth-led. So the young people that are part and parcel of our organization are also students. They are also people who've just graduated from university. So from that regard, you find that many of us within the organization are trying to see how best we can all be able to express ourselves and also have at least decent income, as it were. So the major priority for us is how to build these strategic partnerships so that we can, execute our vision as an organization into raising, you know, good citizens, but also be able to sustain ourselves. Another challenge is, because most of our work revolves around governance issues, is shrinking democratic spaces. Exactly, that's a major issue, because you find that many civil society organizations, not just in Zambia, but just across the continent, usually have to filter the way they say certain things. Even constructive criticism can be seen as a political statement, and you can be labeled as opposition. So that is also one of the challenges that we face. Another challenge, and perhaps this one is the most passionate one for us as an organization, is our ability to reach the grassroots. We do a lot of work around policy advocacy. Right now, we were part of the pioneering organizations in Zambia that was pioneering what we call the Ruth Kangwa petition. So a young lady from Zambia called Ruth Kangwa petitioned for the repeal and replacement of the National Youth Development Act, which was retrogressive in a sense because it was instituted in 1986. So as an organization, we're one of the pioneering organizations who did that. We've done policy work, but we also want to reach grassroots. We want to reach the marginalized youth, those people, those youth that are in rural areas. And that has been a challenge. So we're working with government in that regard to seeing how we can tackle that. So some of the initiatives we work on as Youth Unite Zambia, we have got what we call the School of Governance Advocacy. So this is a hybrid, it's a hybrid platform where we have young people come and learn on the different governance systems of our country. So we teach them things like, you know, basic understanding the budget process, understanding the electoral process, understanding the political systems, the history of Zambia's political nature, and try to build those basic fundamentals of what it means to be a citizen that participates civically in that school. So it's a 6-month program, and we have strategic partnerships with different organizations. We also have campaigns around electoral issues. We are trying to, we're part of a coalition of youth organizations that is trying to see how we can transform Zambia's electoral process from first past the post to one that has a multifaceted parliamentary system where we can have youth quotas. We don't have that system in Zambia. We know countries like South Africa has got a similar system that accounts for at least each demographic in the country. So advocating for that. So we work around governance issues, both from a democratic point of view and economic point of view.
So, I mean, you mentioned, you know, the concept of a shrinking space, especially for civic and civil society organizations. But there's also the other dimension, which, you know, for some of us who have been studying this, we also talk about a shifting space. And how has that been for you in terms of, so shifting in the sense that it could be shifting in terms of your relationship today with this particular, let's say, government in place, could be conflictual, maybe based on what you're working on. And then tomorrow, you know, there could be a new regime, and it shifts, and then maybe you are now in good terms. And those that were on the other side, the door keeps revolving. I'm keen to hear how you are mitigating both the shifting and shrinking dimensions of the space in which you operate.
That's a really good question. I think as an organization, we've tried to be as neutral and centric as possible. And I'll explain what I mean when I say that. Usually in the non-profit civil society space, there is a great temptation to actually transition from being an organization to being a political proxy. There is a fine line between those two. Political proxies, in a sense, masquerade as civil society organizations that do the bidding of politicians to execute their agendas. Now, remember the challenge I mentioned earlier. Issues of funding and finance. Many civil society organizations who are unable to finance their activities usually fall prey to this particular trap. So you find that they would be in good books with a specific regime because they are getting resource or opportunities, and then when that regime comes out of power, then, opposition labels that regime as, you know, no, those are the opposition. So as an organization, we have a policy of being non-partisan in a sense, and we've made that public. We've put that on record. And the types of checks and balances of, you know, bringing putting government accountable is always premised from objectivity. And that doesn't just go to government. It goes to all political players, because regardless of whether a government is in power or not, the people in opposition also lead hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So they're also leaders in a sense, and they also need to be kept accountable. And we try to maintain that particular balance whilst trying to understand, or perhaps even just get a certain feel of diplomacy, in a sense.
Right.
It's a little bit of a risky move, because you really don't want to be put in a specific light. So this is why we're always very outspoken about our objectivity and neutrality.
Yet at the same time, because you are a youth-led and an organization that is focusing on young people's issues, at times the issues that you are raising on their own can cause political tensions between yourselves and those in power.
That's true.
In that regard, how do you raise those issues without falling into the category that then gets to be either ostracized or labeled as part of the opposition, even if you are not, but you are just focusing on the issues? Remember, speaking truth to power at times is a political statement on its own.
Yes.
So I'm keen, because young people's issues, whether we like it or not, they are existential issues, and some of them demand systemic and transformative changes.
Yes.
And transformative changes actually means at times that you have to deal with the status quo head on.
Yes, and that is a very true statement. So one of the philosophies that we have is that we believe politics is like a contact sport. You cannot play politics in any sense and not be hurt. You know, and we are not naive to that fact. We have been on record to say certain things that have injured certain people. But at the end of the day, it is about honing who you are and remaining true to what you stand for. But aside from just remaining true to what you stand for, it's also about self-awareness as an organization, understanding the environment, when to be activists and when to be advocates, when to wear the suit or when to lift the placard. And I think understanding this, dynamic for us, we look at it from a very sociological point of view. Who are the actors that are at play? What are the patterns of those actors, and how do they respond to certain stimuli? If a situation needs to be dealt with head on, we do not do it in isolation. So we understand the value of allies. Allies that are in media, allies that are in religious institutions, the churches, right? Allies that are in fellow civil society organizations. Because at the end of the day, it's not about what Youth Unite Zambia is saying, but what the collective voice of the citizens are being brought forth. Remember, the civil society is fundamentally about the representation of the ordinary citizen. So again, it's not just about the organization, but how do we bring this collective that even when we're dealing with something head on, we've got allies to help us stand our ground against the powers that be.
So I also wanted to maybe talk a bit about, young people and their participation in your programs, or how you engage them.
Right.
Because, I mean, young people are not a monolithic group. So you spoke about young people in rural areas and young people in, let's say, in the urban areas. But even within those who are in the urban areas, there are different pockets of different sets of young people. You've got those that are marginalized, those that are not so much marginalized, those living with certain abilities, others without, certain educational standards and so forth. And then the rural areas also, so those dynamics play themselves. How have you found to be the different dynamics working with different segments of youth, let's say rural versus urban, etc.?
To be honest with you, I think that one has really helped us stretch our capacity and understand that the need for systemic change from a young person's perspective is not a sprint but a marathon. Because you can get a crop of university students who've decided to start an organization, throw them into the rural area, and they will not know how to translate or communicate that particular message. That can be fundamentally good, but not received well because of the mode of communication. So then that would mean learning adaptation, right? And that has been our foundation in that regard. I think adaptation, the ability to, learn environments in the quickest possible time is what has helped us as an organization, which hasn't come as a singular, activity, but we rely on networks that we build, right? We build a lot of networks. So as an organization, we're registered under the National Youth Development Council of Zambia, which is the registering entity for youth-led organizations in Zambia. So we use that umbrella quasi-government institution, umbrella body, to create networks not only with urban youth, but all demographics represented, persons living with disabilities, young women, young female youths, young people in rural areas, those that are not in the middle class, those that are in the corporate space. We use such networks to ensure that we learn how to adapt, because it's one thing just to ask people to do your work for you. It's another thing to actually learn and then replicate so that you're not too dependent on that regard. So adaptation is key.
So, of course, another thing that I wanted to get back to is that you started this thing because you had this idea, you know, at your university setting, and then years down, you translate that idea into something.
Yes.
Most institutions would actually say one of my biggest challenges has been access to funding. What is your biggest challenge?
Our biggest challenge perhaps is access to many young people. Like I mentioned earlier, we are a very policy-oriented organization. So, for example, we do not need, in case there are donors watching, please, we need the funding.
Of course,
But we are not very, we don't need the kind of funding that does so much activity on the ground.
Right.
But we have recognized a gap in that. Because that is, in a sense, a top-down approach. And if you need to get work done, you need to visit the grassroots. So reaching out to the grassroots. And this is the adaptability that we're talking about, you know. So that has been our challenge, to be honest with you. Reaching young people, grassroots, is not as easy as people think. Yes, we are currently experiencing the fourth industrial revolution. The digital space is larger than it is. But believe you me, even with that, it is still difficult to reach the heart and mind of somebody in the rural area because of not just inaccessibility, but perhaps even just a cultural shock, right? Many young people in rural areas are not really abreast with the idea of civil society organizations. Perhaps maybe you find a young person whose lived experience of interacting with the corridors of power is their headman, their chief, their household, and with extremely conservative values, then the political figures that are present. So when you bring an idea that challenges those particular structures, even digitally, you'll find that there's a particular challenge. So we have faced such kind of instances and dynamics where, you know, you get to a certain place, we experience cultural shock, or they are experiencing their own cultural shock. So yes, that has been our biggest challenge.
I would imagine that in addition to probably even breaking down the idea or the concept of a civil society formation, is I think this is further even complicated by the idea of asking young people that you are focusing on policy. And policy, to most people who need basic needs, it's almost an abstract concept.
Exactly.
And we know that, you know, policy work is also long term.
Yes.
You don't get today and then tomorrow you have a policy.
Exactly.
You know, it's an elaborate process, and so that could be really challenging. You know, for you as an organization to actually be on that path. But why? Why do you stick to that path? It sounds like there's something fundamental that is driving you, and I want to get to what exactly is driving you to the policy space, as opposed to, for example, you could have done
grassroots, you could have done, That's a really important point. I think it all stems down to how we believe nations fail. No pun intended, but there's a book that was written, Why Nations Fail. And, you know, the authors of that book are very categorical on how they, you know, analyze both inclusive institutions and extractive institutions. And we believe in, as an organization, we believe that inclusivity in power dynamics is very fundamental for the strengthening of institutions. And combining that with the kind of neutrality that we have placed on ourselves as an organization, we feel that rather than just engaging grassroots and advocating from that front, we can be the sort of like the casting shadow of the citizens in the political spaces. And we're very privileged to have a lot of young people who are very competent in this space, them being young students, graduates, people who are doing their own consultancies around governance issues. You'll find that because of how we have really made it, you know, as our brainchild to be very, you know, to have intellectual acumen that is necessary for the space. I think it feeds well to that whole process and dynamic of accepting our strengths whilst working on our weaknesses. And one of our strengths are how to engage political figures, how to engage people from a policy level, how to ensure that the government that believes that this particular document is great, making them change their mind on that particular premise without causing a revolution on the ground, right? I think that is a very complicated skill to master. We haven't mastered it, but we are up for the challenge, trying to see how best we can be very effective in that space. We need youth on the ground. We also need youth speaking at the table.
So talking about collaborations and these engagements and synergies, I'm aware, for example, that it's so beyond Zambia where you are located. You know, when you now start to get into maybe continental, regional levels, for example, Zambia is the seat for ECOSOC.
Yes.
I'm keen to know whether you are already engaging them. How are youth generally in Zambia aware of this body, which is actually a civil society, AU body? How popular is it among young people, and how are young people engaged? You can obviously use the example of your institution.
Yes. Thank you so much. So, AU ECOSOC is, as you've mentioned, sitting in Zambia. That's where the secretariat is. And as an organization, we have engaged with ECOSOC extensively. Majority of their programming as an organization were part of their network of civil society organizations they engage with in Zambia. And its popularity amongst young people and youth-led organizations has only started rising. Because ECOSOC's growth has also just started rising. So their presence in Zambia has been heavily felt. So they're running a program that is being supported by GIZ on the sensitization of the protocol establishing the free movement of persons, which Zambia is a signatory to, but we haven't ratified. So they've done sensitization programs within Zambia and different other African countries. They've also done a lot of work around peace and security issues. Just recently, we convened a stakeholder engagement, 2 stakeholder engagements with the APSA, the AU APSA architecture. We convened with also different international organizations around, you know, peace and security issues. And they've engaged civil society organizations in Zambia. But their engagement is not only from their point of view. For organizations like Youth Unite Zambia, we help spread that information to civil society organizations that there's this body called ECOSOC, and you don't have to sit in the General Assembly of ECOSOC to engage with ECOSOC, because this is the voice of the African citizenry, and it's the only organization that the AU has. It's the only organ that the AU has that directly interacts with the African citizens. So it's an Africa-centric organ of the AU. And as an organization, we always encourage civil society organizations, not only in Zambia, but all across the continent, to engage deeply with AU ECOSOC and the kind of work that they're doing.
So let's talk now about the other hat that you wear. Earlier today, when you were speaking on the panel, you spoke about your role as an AU IOM Migration Youth Ambassador.
Right.
But you also said you are not the only one. There are others in different parts of the continent. Just paint a picture for someone who doesn't really know what this is about.
Okay.
You know, what is this genesis? What are the functions that are to be carried by youth ambassadors like yourselves? And what are some of the exciting things that we should be aware of?
Okay, great. So, as you've mentioned, I currently hold a position of Migration Youth Ambassador for the Southern African region with the AU and IOM. So the Migration Youth Ambassadorship Program is the brainchild of the African Union Commission, as well as the International Organization for Migration Special Liaison Office to the AU. So that's IOM SLO. And the whole premise of this particular program is to enhance youth voices in the migration space. That is representing the voices of young migrants, but also doing advocacy and awareness and implementing initiatives around the different aspects of migration as a theme. So we've got 5 migration youth ambassadors covering the north, east, south, west, and central regions of Africa. And each migration youth ambassador has to be from that particular region indigenously. So some of the work that we do is we obviously engage different stakeholders on issues around migration from a youth perspective, of course. We've been privileged to be part and parcel of the Pan-African Forum on Migration, where we added youth voice on the deliberations with member states. Just this year, I was privileged to be part of the Africa Regional Forum on Sustainable Development. And as the youth ambassadors, we added a voice to Africa's position for the Summit for the Future. And some of the recommendations there we made are going to go to New York for the Summit for the Future. We also engage grassroots, not just on the political level. As Migration Youth Ambassador for Southern Africa, I've completed just last month, 2 months ago rather, I was in Malawi doing capacity building training for tertiary students. So I was training them in the concept of trafficking in persons and how they can be aware in just the different processes of trafficking in persons. Replicated that training also in Zimbabwe. We've also been part and parcel of the Africa-Europe Regular Pathways initiative, where we are trying to see how we can engage young people from Europe and Africa and to see what are the needs that are being faced. So all in all, this ambassadorship program focuses on 3 particular thematics, which are the strategic areas of IOM. Number 1, saving lives and protecting people on the move. Number 2, driving solutions to displacement. And thirdly, facilitating regular pathways for migration. And we use advocacy, awareness raising, capacity building, stakeholder political engagement, and innovation to see how best we can influence the migration space.
So earlier on, I mean, during the day, you handed me a report, and obviously I said, you know what, when we've got time, let's maybe unpack it. Are there any specific trends or findings that you just want to speak to?
Right. So yes, this year in April, IOM recently published the Africa Migration Report 2024. We annually publish this report to understand the different migration dynamics that the continent is facing. One of the primal things that we have found in that report is looking at the migration trends of Africans. There's always a popular opinion that most migration that happens from Africans goes outside the continent. But we found that 83% of all migration that happens in Africa is intra-African migration. So Africans are moving more to African countries than anywhere else, which is an interesting concept. And to add to that finding, we've also found that in as much as majority of the migration is intra-African. Majority of that migration is irregular. So we have seen a lot of gaps within the migration governance space, especially in the context of harmonization of policies. So there are about 33 countries, for example, that have ratified the Free Movement Protocol by the African Union, that have actually signed it, not ratified. There are only 4 countries that have ratified it, which is an interesting dynamic, considering that there are 47 countries that have ratified the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So we're talking about free movement of goods, but not free movement of labor, of people, right? And we've seen that as a gap, and this is why you see the African Union now collaborating with different UN agencies, which is earlier in our discussion I mentioned the Joint Labour Migration Program, where IOM, ILO, the African Union, as well as the United Nations Economic Commission of Africa have come together to enhance labor mobility and spread awareness for it. So this means speaking to stakeholders like government in ensuring that, you know, governments ratify and harmonize protocols around, you know, the mobility of people. So such kinds of dynamics, trends, discussions are found in this particular report. IOM also prides itself in data. We're very big on data, considering migration dynamics are happening every moment of every day. So you need data to be coming in quickly. And this report is actually really comprehensively put in just seeing what the migration trends are and what is the outlook for Africa in terms of our human mobility.
Great. So I mean, I will also find time and go through it. As you are saying, I'm already looking at some of the implications, for example, on diaspora giving. You know, I'm looking at it from the philanthropy point of view. The notion is always that people are all overseas, and we look at remittances from that perspective. But you know, if the trend is that people are moving within Africa, again, it's important to look into that. But finally, I'm looking at you, I'm listening to you, I'm hearing the stories. You strike me as somebody who's got so much energy. You're full of energy, but you are also what I could call a driver of change of some sort. So when people are listening to you, hearing what you are saying, looking at the work that you are doing, both as an ambassador, but also for the youth association that you set up, and they're asking themselves, who is Walter? What do we take home and say, this is Walter? Who is Walter? What's your background?
Okay, thank you so much. It's interesting that you've asked this question at this point. So Walter is a product of a community who raised him up. So my background is my academic background is in development studies. I studied development studies from the University of Zambia, currently pursuing my master's degree in human rights governance and development. So that is where my academic background is coming from. But aside from that, within the multilateral space and also the public policy space, I'm the product of mentorship. I pride myself in wanting to learn from people like you, right? And people that have gone before me as pillars of, you know, of motivation, of strength. I'm also an author. I've authored 2 books. The first book that I authored is called A Beacon of Hope, How to Unlock Zambia's Potential. And in this book, I talk about the different governance implications of Zambia and my blueprint vision for the country. Recently just finished writing my next book called Borders to Bridges, Migration and the Dream of African Unity, where I'm looking at the different dynamics of facilitating regular pathways to migration and redefining Pan-Africanism from the context of migration and seeing how we can build a united Africa. We'll be announcing the publishing date soon, and hopefully...
But where is the Pan-Africanism coming from? Most young people today are not really attuned to the Pan-African ideals, and partly because of the economic conditions, but partly also because of the level of education that we are at.
Right.
But where is this level of consciousness around Africa and the continent coming from?
I think this has stemmed from my family, actually.
Yeah.
So my mom's indigenous country is South Africa.
Okay.
And my father is Zambian.
Yeah.
But even within Zambia, his great-great-grandfather, his grandfather, who's my great-grandfather, relocated from one area to the next. So if you look at my surname, it represents one region. But the language my father's family speaks is a different one. So I'm a product of migration. I'm a product of Africa. So whenever I'm asked, where are you from? Who do you represent? I've always had the innate feeling that I am African in a sense. And then because of that, I delved into wanting to understand what does it mean to be African. And I found something very striking. Chapter 1 of my book, I talked about migration through the ages. I interrogate Carthage and the Egyptian pyramids. I interrogate the Bantu migration from 1500 BC, the Pygmies and the Great Rift Valley, and seeing the similarities and the striking similarities today. I mean, when you go to West Africa, their staple food is banku. When you come to East Africa, we're here in Mombasa, staple food is ugali. When you come to Zambia, in Bemba we say uwali, which is a similarity in Bantu. Go to Zimbabwe, tsadza. When you go to South Africa, pap, right? And these are small nitty-gritties about the kinds of similarities we have, or perhaps even just traditions of lobola, dowry, right? Are very similar. These are the DNA of the Africanness that we have. But we're not talking about it from a homogeneous sense, but from understanding that there is unity in diversity and we have a shared history. And that is where my drive comes in, and seeing that, no, we can be one as a people. We need to break down the borders that divide into bridges that unite.
So certainly you are a driver of change, and I think young people do need people like you, and I'm sure young people also listen to you. So if I say to you, what is one message that Walter wants to give, not just to the youth in Zambia, but to the continent, and I say there's the camera.
Okay, thank you. So my fellow young people, I fundamentally believe that the young people of Africa are the enlightened and dynamic force upon whom the future and destiny of our continent lies. And it will not take one individual to change the face of this continent. It is our collective effort. So let us unite as one with our different talent, skills, and abilities to ensure that we create the Africa that we want.
On that note, thank you so much, Walter. That was Walter Kasemba from Youth Unite Zambia, but also, as you heard, an ambassador of the AU-IOM migration for the continent. Thank you so much, Walter.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.